And my biggest fear was that there would be Bill Browder fatigue, that people would stop caring about Sergei Magnitsky and my cause and what I was doing. And every time there was sort of this fatigue, and there was always, it's human nature, Putin would do something so terrible and so outrageous that he would elevate my relevance again. And I suspect that when it comes to Ukraine, he's got the same tendency.
Bill Browder, welcome to How the Light Gets In.
Great to be here.
So you're someone who did business in Russia during the Wild West days, if you like, of Russian capitalism after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you think an autocrat such as Putin was the inevitable outcome of the circumstances of that era?
Well, so the way that Russia evolved was that it started with Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin was a Democrat. He was interested in free speech, etc. But in order for him to get into power, he basically had to do a deal with the devil. And the deal with the devil was that he would allow 22 oligarchs to become fabulously wealthy in exchange for those oligarchs to use all of their assets and media resources to make sure he got elected. And they complied with their part of the deal, and he complied with his part of the deal. And so in the end, you ended up with 22 oligarchs who controlled more than 40% of the GDP of Russia. And the average Russian was living in abject poverty. The life expectancy for a male at that time was 58 years old. And as a result of that, it created such anger at the oligarchs, such anger at democracy, such anger at the whole system, and such a pent-up demand for a backlash that Putin stepped in to that backlash. And when Putin stepped in, he said, I'm going to get rid of the oligarchs, I'm going to bring power back to the state, et cetera, et cetera. But he didn't do that. I mean, he did that for
he started out doing it.
He did it for a couple of years. I mean, he's been in power now 23 years. He did it for the first 3 years. But after that, he basically arrested the richest oligarch, which, by the way, I cheered, because I thought, okay, one down, 21 to go. And then, but he did that in order for the oligarchs, the rest of them, to see that they had to go do a deal with him. And they all said, what's the deal? And he said 50%. And that was when Putin became the richest man in the world, and became the biggest oligarch himself. And he didn't dismantle the system of oligarchs. The oligarchs continued to exist. They held 50% of his, 50% of their wealth was to him. And then he then cultivated new oligarchs who were his pals from judo class and lakeside resort where he had his summer house and various other things. And so now you have Putin, who's worth 200 billion or maybe a lot more. And then if you add up all the oligarchs around him, it adds up to $1 trillion of money that was stolen from the Russian state.
So do you think it was basically Putin's personal decision at the time? He could have just gone on to dismantle the remaining 21 oligarchs, but he just thought, well, I can get really rich from this, and decided not to? Or were there structural forces, you think, that would have pushed him in that direction?
Well, I think there's cultural forces in Russia. I mean, basically, there's not a single person I've ever come across in Russia that doesn't go into government in order to enrich themselves, from the lowest traffic police officer to the president of Russia. I've never seen it. Here in the UK and in the United States, many people go into public service to serve the public, and there's great joy from doing good. There's not an ounce of that in Russia. Nobody that I've ever met in government has any feeling of that responsibility. It's just purely to enrich yourself, and the higher you are in the whole system, the richer you get. And so I think it was kind of inevitable, just based on the culture of Russia, which is this very cynical culture, and maybe not to even blame the Russians on it, because they've been so beaten down through any initiative, any goodwill has sent you to the gulags for generations. And so why, from their perspective, why do anything different? And Putin was just part of that, and he was very good at it.
What would you call the economy of Russia today? So it supposedly transitions from communism to capitalism, but it's a very bizarre type of capitalism because you have to be mates with the president or have to be in that kind of like privileged circle. What is the economy of Russia today?
It's not capitalism at all. It's just the economy of Russia is just one big criminal organization. That's what it is. The top crime boss is Putin, and then he's got sub-crime bosses, and it's all organized like a major criminal organization. It's not like you can go to Russia, set up a business, succeed, and be allowed to succeed. Any person who sets up a business in Russia has to become part of the criminal organization. If you don't, you have all your stuff stolen from you, you go to jail, you might die. And so it creates this unbelievable incentive for anybody who's got any talent in business either to leave, and many people do, or to become a criminal. That's it. Only two options.
So because of this, you have championed the passing of the so-called Magnitsky Acts, not just in Russia, but around the world. It's named in honor of your lawyer who died in prison after he was interrogated by the Russian state. And these are supposed to be sanctions on individuals, right? Because the idea is these people are super wealthy. They are in all these big cities, New York, London, take advantage of all the wealth and freedoms of these countries. And the idea is that they need to be sanctioned so that they don't enjoy those privileges. What's the purpose of that?
Well, so it all comes back to my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky uncovered a $230 million government corruption scheme. He was a good patriot. He exposed it, testified against the people involved. And in retaliation, the people involved arrested him, tortured him for 358 days, and killed him in Russian police custody on November 16, 2009. And so in my effort to get justice, it was impossible to get justice in Russia. So I said, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And what I identified was that the people who killed him and the people who do many similar types of crimes take the money, they do it for money, they do it in Russia, and then they take the money outside of Russia and they put it in New York or London or Geneva. And they travel. They put their wives, their children in boarding schools, and they send their parents to Harley Street doctors, and they enjoy all the great things that civilized society has to offer in the West. And they behave like these murderous barbarians in Russia. And so the best way to stop that is to freeze their assets and ban their travel. And it's much, much better to go after the individuals than it is to go after the country, because if you go after the country, they don't care that they're still bringing, we went after Iran and they put plane loads of caviar and champagne and Mercedes cars and sent them to the elite. But if you go after the individuals and leave the people alone, that has a profound effect. And we know how a profound an effect it has, because when the Magnitsky Act was passed in the United States, Putin went out of his mind. It was like Battleship, and we got a direct hit. He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families in retaliation. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He even sent an emissary to Trump Tower in June of 2016, before Trump was elected, to beg for him to repeal the Magnitsky Act. This is something which we found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime, which is their money.
Why does Putin find it so troubling, given that the logic in some ways of the Magnitsky Acts is there are all these oligarchs, we want to sort of make their lives harder so that they might put pressure, say, on Putin to change policy or avoid doing certain things. But I've heard you say that these oligarchs are powerless on the face of Putin. They can't really put pressure on him because they're too afraid of him. So what's the logic there? Why is it so damaging to them?
It's very simple. The oligarchs are holding money for Putin. When you see an oligarch who's worth 20 billion, 10 billion of it's Putin's. So if you sanction that oligarch, you're sanctioning Putin. After the war started, like a week after, the United States and various other countries imposed sanctions on Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and various others, which was a really good thing to do and very symbolic, but Putin doesn't hold any money in his own name. He understands that if there was ever a document, if there was ever a piece of paper, a bank statement that said Vladimir Putin on it, somebody could come to him and say, listen, Vladimir, I'm going to put this out into the public unless you do this, this, and this for me. And Putin is a blackmailer. This is what he does. He either kills, blackmails, or bribes in order to get people to do stuff for him. And so he understands that that would expose him. So what does he do? He finds people that he can trust. And there's no such thing as real, true trust in Russia. So he finds people he can trust, various oligarchs and friends and various other people. And he says, I want you to hold this money for me, or 50% of what you already made belongs to me now. And when I send you an instruction, you make the payment. And of course, this is also not just about trust, it's also about power. Putin needs to show these guys that if they defy him in any way, they go to jail, they lose their money, and they die. And so these oligarchs, who most of us, if we see them in the world, they're like these chest-thumping alpha male on steroids, tough guys. But they're just a bunch of little weaselly wusses when they're around Putin. And I've seen it. In Davos, Switzerland, I was there when Putin showed up and all the oligarchs were there, and it's unbelievable to watch the body language. I mean, these guys are like just the most timid school children in his presence.
So how would you judge the effectiveness of sanctions like Magnitsky Acts and others against Russia since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine? Because there are those people that say, well, nothing's working. Russia's not stopping the war. It hasn't really influenced its economy. The ruble was shooting up in value. So what do you think sanctions are doing so far?
Well, they're causing great pain, in the same way as Ukrainian missiles are causing great pain. And it's our job to cause Putin as much pain as possible. Now, we can't blame sanctions for not working when we haven't done the sanctions to the full extent that we should be doing them. If we really wanted to stop this war, we should embargo the sale of Russian oil to the West and to the East. If Russia no longer generated money from the sale of oil, then they would have to look to their savings. And their savings are frozen. The central bank reserves are frozen, and the oligarchs' money is frozen. Then they'd have to look for, can we borrow the money? And guess what? That's also frozen. The capital markets are cut off from Russia. But at the moment, every day, Russia generates between $500 million and $1 billion in terms of revenues from oil. So if we want to stop this war, we should just finish it off, follow through all the way.
But do you think the West alone has the power to do that? Say Europe and other kind of Western-friendly countries stop buying oil from Russia. We already know that Russia is selling oil to India and China. There's the BRICS alliance now emerging. Doesn't Russia have alternative markets where it can sell its goods?
Yeah, but we also have the power to stop them from buying. We could tell the Indians, if you want to buy Russian oil, that's great. But don't expect to export any goods to Europe. And you know what? The Indians would fold in a flick of an eye. I mean, there is absolutely no. I mean, there's a small incentive for a huge disincentive, and we just need to have a more robust and muscular policy to end this war. And at the moment, the people who are in charge of the policy they're not getting distracted. The war's been going on for a while, and they're letting this huge loophole continue, which is the sale of this oil.
Isn't that because we don't really have that option of stopping the purchasing of oil from Russia? We need the energy, and we don't have alternative sources at the moment where we can get it from.
We have alternative sources. I mean, another example is that the argument against it is that if 10% of the world's oil leaves the market or can't go onto the market, then the oil price would shoot up. We'd have high inflation. We're fighting with inflation already. It's a painful thing. Nobody wants it. That's a very valid argument. The counter argument is there's other people who produce oil, who we have leverage over. The United States provides a military shield for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia could easily increase the production of oil and allow us not to have that problem. Why are we not using that leverage?
So Saudi Arabia, the United Emirates, other countries, Iran, are now joining BRICS. What do you make of that? Do you think it's going to become a sort of geopolitical force? Is it going to become a little bit like, I don't know, the G7 or NATO? These are all emerging markets. These are countries that are becoming richer and richer every year. Where do you see this going?
Well, I mean, the big idea is having a BRICS currency. And when I hear that, I just laugh. It's never going to happen in a million years. Who would want to hold the currency of Russia
What about China, though?
I wouldn't want to own the currency of China. China is the most arbitrary, uncertain, bad place. And by the way, China is no economic miracle. China is going through a problem right now, which is just going to get worse and worse and worse. And so, I remember when I was in business school. I graduated business school in 1989, and at the time, Japan was the be-all and end-all. Their stock market was trading at an all-time high. The value of the 1 mile in the central Tokyo was more than the value of all real estate in California. We were studying how Japanese did their things, and now Japan is like nothing. And that's the same. I guarantee you, in 20 years' time, when we're looking at China, we're going to see the same thing. China was a failed economic experiment. Authoritarianism, lack of free speech, demographics, all this kind of stuff doesn't lead to good economic outcomes. And it's not as if there's millions of people on boats trying to get into China. You've got people trying to leave China to get into the United Kingdom and the United States and Canada and various other places. You can just tell by where the immigration is flowing, who's doing what, and where people want to be.
But you mentioned earlier, if Russia wanted to borrow money, where would it borrow it from? BRICS has set up this sort of antithesis to the World Bank. They see it as a sort of like development bank, that they're going to be lending money to all these other countries. Could that prove to be a sort of force of BRICS? Could that become the institution that sort of funds the development of that group?
Yeah, on an extremely small scale. I mean, these are numbers that would come, that would help Russia for a week, not for a year, not for 5 years.
You live in London. We talked earlier about how London has become the home of all these Russian oligarchs and plutocrats. The war in Ukraine has exposed even more the fact that Russian money has its sort of tentacles in London property and all sorts of kind of assets. Why did we find ourselves here? Why did we allow Russia to have such a kind of big influence over the capital of the United Kingdom? And can that be undone?
Well, I think it's being undone slowly as we speak. These people are no longer welcome here now. But your question is a really good one. They came here, and the British establishment welcomed Russian gangsters and oligarchs with open arms, and completely looked the other way when it came to where the money came from, who these people were, what kind of people these people were. I mean, if Pablo Escobar and his drug cartel had showed up in London, we would not have welcomed them. But the people from Russia who came here have committed crimes similar to Pablo Escobar. And the lawyers, the accountants, the bankers, the luxury goods salespeople, the concierges of London just welcome them without any question. And I think this comes, this is sort of a trading center. There was this, history of colonialism and, eating in the fine men's clubs on German Street, and then doing the terrible things in India and Africa. And I think that there's a sort of culture of acceptance here, that it doesn't matter what happens abroad, everything is fine here. And that was the culture that allowed all this money. And I know all sorts of people who sold their souls for Russian money during this 20-year period when all the money flowed here.
And do you think this can be undone simply in virtue of sort of government legislation, or is there going to have to be a sort of change in our cultural attitude to this sort of influence of money in public life?
Well, I think the Russian stuff is being undone because of the atrocities committed in Ukraine, and it's unacceptable, and the British public no longer allows, just can't tolerate that. The British public has been really good on the Ukraine conflict, really good. But the establishment, the rules, the government, the law enforcement agencies are not fit for purpose when it comes to dealing with dirty money. And we may not welcome Russian money because we've now sort of highlighted that. But the Saudis are here, no problem, and they're committing terrible crimes in Saudi Arabia. There's a person just sentenced to death for retweeting some tweets critical of the government. We welcome Kazakh money. We welcome all sorts of other money from all sorts of other really dodgy places. And there's not been one inch of change when it comes to that.
How do you see the future of Russia after Putin? You know, Putin might not be here for much longer. There's all this speculation about what might happen to him. Do you think Russia can transform into a genuine democracy, or will it just be the next autocrat taking over?
Well, I think there's a 90% chance it's more of the same, and probably more of the same with Putin. I mean, all this rumors about his health are probably wishful thinking. I think the most likely base case scenario is that 5-10 years from now we're still dealing with Putin, unfortunately. If he is not to be in power, the most likely scenario is another kleptocrat type of character would step in. But there is hope. There are a few people out there. Vladimir Kara-Murza, close friend of mine, Ilya Yashin. These are all people who are sitting in jail right now for challenging Putin, for asking, for demanding democracy in Russia. And we shouldn't underestimate the hunger inside every person to want to live freely. It's a demand and a desire of most people. And no matter how much oligarchs and kleptocrats and tyrants try to game the system, it goes against human nature.
And what about the West in relation to the conflict in Ukraine? Do you think we will manage to toughen up even more towards Russia and stop buying oil from them, or is the opposite going to happen? Are we going to start getting war fatigue and losing interest and feeling more of the pain of inflation and all the rest of it, and eventually kind of allowing Russia to win the war?
Well, sadly, the second, what I see as a trend towards not supporting Ukraine in the United States, it's become part of the MAGA Republican Party ticket to not support Ukraine. Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, wouldn't welcome Vladimir Zelensky to address the House of Representatives this week while he was in Washington. It's the Slovak president is now, or I should say the leading candidate for president is now saying no more weapons for Ukraine. There's a lot of murmur and undertone of that. However, I've been through my own sort of microcosm of this conflict for many years, more than a decade. I've been in conflict with Putin over the murder of Sergei Magnitsky. And my biggest fear was that there would be Bill Browder fatigue, that people would stop caring about Sergei Magnitsky and my cause and what I was doing. And every time there was sort of this fatigue, and there was always, it's human nature, Putin would do something so terrible and so outrageous that he would elevate my relevance again. And I suspect that when it comes to Ukraine, he's got the same tendency, which is that when people are starting to say, war is going on for such a long time, it's expensive, etc., he'll do something so outrageous that even the most awful people who want to capitulate won't have the ability to push in that direction.
You mentioned MAGA in the United States. When Trump was in power, he came close to doing a deal with Putin over giving you over to the Russian authorities. Do you think if we see a Trump presidency number 2, these cozy relations with Putin will come back, or do you think the war in Ukraine has changed that?
No, I mean, Trump is Trump. If Trump is president, I think the U.S. support for Ukraine will stop the next day. I think that Putin will he will succeed in winning, not just in Ukraine, but all of a sudden other places will be at risk. I think it's probably the most dangerous thing that could happen to the world if Trump becomes president, because he seems to be, for reasons that still nobody quite understands, he seems to want to side with Putin, over democracy.
Bill Browder, thank you very much.
Thank you.